Well, I've blocked the door, so we're not going to have a BBC moment.
And we're like, hey, we're the Troublesome Terps. This is a mic in your face.
What should I tell them?
So usually my job on the show is making sure that we fill the outtakes.
Yeah, no, I like the outtakes. They're great.
Very good.
That's great. I didn't do any deep preparation because I think it probably flows a little better if I just kind of make it up as I go. But
you know how this works.
You've come to the right place. Yeah.
See, I get in trouble for cracking those kind of jokes.
When I do my SlatorCon presentation, I always prepare the speaker notes. I never use them.
My favourite story is I was interpreting at an under-20s rugby international, and Scotland were being beaten 69-19 by France. And I said to some of the analysts in the VIP room, look, please, I don't want Scotland to lose any more points. And they said, what, is it embarrassment? I said, no, it's just French numbers over 70 are really hard.
Welcome to Troublesome Terps, the podcast about things that keep interpreters up at night. On today's show, we're talking headlines and trends. But before we get there, it's time to once again introduce the other members of our troublesome trio. First off, our favorite Lederhosenwearer, it's Alexander Gansmeier. Good evening.
Jesus Christ, that was. I like that. Yeah.
I always try to crack you up, just.
Yeah, it's not that hard. I'm a good audience, I think, for being cracked up. But it's good to see all those talking heads back again in action.
Absolutely. And also with us again is a man who apparently knows exactly what Scotsmen wear under their kilts. Jonathan Downey, do you care to go into any more detail, or would you rather not?
I'm not going to tell anyone. So the answer to that is exactly the same as the answer to the question, what do interpreters do when they can't find the word? We're not allowed to tell anyone.
Exactly.
Certain secrets that have to be kept secret.
That's true. My name is Alexander Drexel, but our guest today will almost certainly be familiar to your inbox or web browser. He, or rather his company, has become to the translation industry what Bloomberg is to finance. Welcome to the co-founder and managing director of Slator, Florian Faes. Good evening. How are you?
Hey, I'm good. How are you? Thanks so much for having me here, Alexander.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show, and we've been working on this and preparing this for a while. So it's great that it's finally happening. Before we get into the headlines and trends, as we said earlier, we were wondering a little bit about your professional background, Florian. So maybe you can give us just a quick summary of what you've been doing before you started Slator, basically.
Before I started Slator, yeah, I've done a few things. So I actually started out in a job that's really not related to what I'm doing right now. I was an electrician. I did one of those Swiss apprenticeships, when you start right after, I don't know what you would call maybe high school or college in America or the UK, and you start at 16. So I did a 4-year apprenticeship as an electrician, and then we graduate this program here, and then I went to worked a little bit on construction sites, and I went traveling a lot, and during those travels I kind of discovered that I like working or interacting with languages, and then I through some different routes ended up in a translation and interpreting program at the Zurich University of Applied Sciences in Zurich here. And I did Spanish and English as second language, and my native language is German. So I did that for 4 years. And part of the studies was I went to London for a year and did an MA in translation at the University of Westminster. So that's what kind of got me into translation. I did skip the interpreting part. I'm really impressed by what you guys are doing. It blows my mind how you can actually do simultaneous interpreting. So the simultaneous interpreting part would have added 2 years to my studies, and I don't think I would have been capable of doing it. Actually, that's all there is. It really, yeah, it's intense. I think we trained it a couple of times, and I think I lost. Like, I don't know what you call this in interpreting language, but I couldn't follow after like 20 seconds, maybe 10 seconds. And then I had a pretty fortunate break. So I applied with a translation company here as a translator in Zurich. And then they were like, well, we don't have a job for you in Zurich, but why don't you go to Singapore? And I'm like, well, that sounds great. So So basically, they sent me to Singapore to do some overnight translation for a couple of major Swiss banking clients. And I, that was a great break. I started working there as a translator, did that for about a year or two, and then quite quickly started helping on the business development side of that company, because it was very exciting, right? I mean, I like translation, but actually, if you see how the business grows, and at the time it grew really fast, so I really helped out on the operations side initially, hiring translator, qualifying freelancers, etc. And then in 2009, I moved to Hong Kong, became the general manager of that office. And then that was heavy on sales. I mean, you did have to do a bit of management, but mostly it was just, growing the business, going out and selling, which is quite a change when you were a translator. You go out there and
I reckon, yeah.
clients, right? Initially, as a translator, you have to be detail obsessed and very kind of structured. And as a salesperson, in a sense, you have to be obviously a lot more outgoing and pushy with people, right?
Sure.
So
assertive, I think, is the word.
Yeah, assertive.
Well
but it does help. I guess what helped was that I knew what I was selling. It was it adds a little bit of legitimacy to your pitch. Which was atrocious, I guess, in the beginning.
Yeah, practice makes perfect, right?
Yeah, I learned on the job, and then I was able to take over responsibility for the entire region, like the Asia region. We were about 60 people at the time, and I moved to Shanghai, mainland China. That was a great experience working there for 3 years. And yeah, then after 8-9 years in Asia, it was time to either really settle down in that part of the world or move back to Switzerland, where I am originally from. And I decided together with my wife, and we had our first son was born in China. We decided to move back to Zurich. And I didn't want to, maybe we'll get into this later a little bit, but I didn't really want to continue being on the translation company side. So I was looking for, what could be next, and also maybe starting my own business. So that's when Slator came in, but maybe you can touch upon that later. So that's kind of in a nutshell what got me here.
Yeah, there was a lot of stuff in there. It's funny that you mentioned that you were an electrician, because just the last episode, actually, Jonathan shared a horror story from his own house where, I don't know if we want to get into this, but maybe you can talk about this bilaterally. But I think you were going to say something anyway, Jonathan, so go ahead.
Yeah, I basically saved my family from being electrocuted through a plug failure, which was lovely.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I noticed when you're talking about your career is that there's traditionally what is uncharitably called the starving artist syndrome amongst translators, which is, they want to do the job, but a lot of them, if you say to them, you're a business person, they look at you oddly. And I think interpreters, we don't seem to have as much of that, but there's still this interpreting thing of, I'll let someone else deal with the sales side. How did you find that your fellow translators kind of dealt with you or treated you when they realised, oh, hold on, he's gone from being a translator to a salesperson? Were you kind of sent away to Coventry, or?
No, I think it was, at the time, there were a lot of internal translators as well in that company, and they had a fair amount of contact also with end clients. I didn't think there was a lot of pushback or anything. I think they liked it. Few would go into a full-on sales role, I guess, right? That's maybe a somewhat unusual transition, but often we actually also pulled translators into meetings because it added that much legitimacy or just credibility to your meeting, right? It's not just some anonymous person that does the translation, but it's actually a human being and an expert that he can present to a client. So no, there was no pushback or anything like that. And I think a lot of the freelancers are extremely entrepreneurial. They run their own 1, 2, 3-man shops. So I think a lot of translators have a fairly entrepreneurial mindset, actually. Yeah,
I think that's been changing for a while already, and it's probably what you said, Jonathan, is probably similar with interpreters, that some freelance interpreters don't really enjoy the whole business and / finance side of the job. I know I didn't, so I'm kind of glad to be in the position that I'm in. Yeah.
But I guess it's also gotten a little easier, right? With all those tools now. 10 years ago, I wouldn't have wanted, just the invoicing and all of that, it was horrendous. I think right now it's a lot easier with all those web tools.
That's true. Yeah. I think there's also a lot of help out there. So there's lots of training that you can get both within our industry, but also from the outside or just online simply.
Sure.
I think also I remember chatting to some interpreters in one of the traditional markets, I don't want to name which, and their view was, that when they had graduated, the idea was you settle down, you fit into the system that's there, and so long as people like you, work comes. And I was talking to one interpreter relatively recently who said, well, that system still exists and still runs in some of the established markets. But there's a realization amongst the younger interpreters that everyone in the so-called weaker markets is having to learn to be a business. And there's this feeling of, are we missing out? It's nice that you can get work to come, but if you fall out with a key person, or if suddenly something goes wrong, there's no safety net. And there's this, I know there's a discussion amongst some interpreters of, do we all need to become business people? And I think it's an interesting discussion that I think is happening in the industries. Even the people in the established markets are beginning to say, do we need to do this business thing as well?
Yeah.
But I particularly think for you, Florian, it's a pretty interesting transition because you kind of were thrown into the deep end, weren't you? I mean, they sent you basically to Asia to work as a translator, and then all of a sudden you turned out to be this like sales pitch guy who had to go out and like talk to the clients like face to face. So I think that transition is particularly interesting. I mean, I get that every translator and every interpreter in a way is their own business and has like a certain business mindset, but
I don't know. Maybe it was also just the 2006, 7, 8 was crazy in Singapore or in Asia in general. I mean, it was boom. I mean, it was booming everywhere, but there it was it was just extreme, right? So there was a lot of gung ho, and business was just coming in, and we just started out there with the company. It was a pretty strategic bet for the company to put a lot of resources behind it. So it was a lot of excitement. So I kind of felt like, hey, I want to be part of this, and also they actually needed the help because you don't find Chinese translators, they don't fall off trees. Like, you need to meet them, vet them. Also, of course, Japanese and Korean and all the other Asian languages we sourced at the time. So it was kind of needed, the help. And then the client thing kind of came naturally. It was actually also a question of resources. The person who headed the whole Asia at the time, he basically told me, man, you can't stay in Singapore, you and me. Like, you just need to go sell in Hong Kong. Like, just, you need the help. Yeah. So yeah, he kind of threw me in at the deep end, but it was great. It was great. And again, it really helps selling something, I think I would have had trouble selling insurance or cars, but this was quite natural, right?
I sold insurance for 7 months.
You did?
Selling interpreting is so much easier.
Yeah.
I sold accidental death insurance.
Oh my God.
Get out.
And the first group of people that we tried to sell accidental death insurance to were pregnant women.
Yeah.
And can you imagine, like dialing, the computer would dial these people, and you go, if you were to die in a bus, train, ship, or plane, and you'd like almost hear the woman rubbing her belly over the phone going, you what?
Oh wow. Yeah,
it's like the really last time, the wrong time to try and sell something to someone.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yep.
Yeah. But you conducted most of that business all in English, or did you have to pick up any Chinese, or I don't know?
No, so Singapore and Hong Kong work very well in English. Singapore especially, obviously, is basically, English-speaking country. Hong Kong, obviously, if you knew the secret Cantonese handshake, that would help. But
wow.
if you're a Cantonese, fluent in Cantonese, fluent in Mandarin, fluent in English, you rule Hong Kong on the sales side. So.
Wow.
So you can do a lot in English. Mainland China was harder. There actually relied a lot more on obviously my local sales colleagues, and there I also had the whole team, so I did a little less of direct sales. So I picked up some Mandarin, but not fluent at all. I mean, it's like you do day-to-day business. I did my morning lessons, but my God, that's a difficult language, frankly.
Oh, for sure, yeah. And did you experience any kind of culture shock, both when you got there and then when you got back maybe to Switzerland?
So when I got there, well, Singapore, I mean, I lived abroad before moving to Singapore quite often, so I didn't have a particular culture. I had a weather shock, frankly. I mean, the weather is just crazy when you move from like Europe, or like in a sense a more moderate climate to the tropics. It's like 365 days. It's just 30 degrees, and it's super
very different
humid
from Switzerland.
Yeah, so you'd get sick a lot in the beginning because of the aircon.
Yeah.
And then, but then you really get used to it. Then, as I transitioned up to China, like Hong Kong and then mainland China, that was relatively. There was no shock because like Singapore kind of prepares you for Hong Kong, Hong Kong prepares you for Shanghai. So it was okay. Coming back was odd in a sense because it's so empty here. like you wouldn't believe. Once you get used to China and then you move here, there's no people.
And some people say Switzerland is densely populated, but
there's
no comparison.
You cannot. There's no one. Even even London would feel empty, frankly. It's just like China is so intense, and then you come back, it's like, whoa, where is everyone? Right?
Yeah.
That was a bit of, not a shock, but it was kind of weird in the first few months. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, you indicated that earlier when you sort of described your path, your professional path, that you then you basically you were thinking about what's next after working for this agency or LSP. I'm just wondering how you made that step and came up with the idea for Slator, or if that was more of a team thing, maybe.
So basically, I attended a bunch of events when I was selling. Like I was, looking. My main markets were like life sciences, finance, legal. And so I was going to a ton of industry events, and we advertised in like industry publications, not translation publications, but like life sciences, legal publications, and websites. And then I was looking for something similar in the translation space, like something that was like day to day, and I didn't find it. And I was like, well, that seems to be there seems to be a niche here, right? Business content for this particular industry, which people are telling us, and now we're telling people that it's it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? Yeah. So I talked to somebody who I used to be a client of. He was the managing director for Asia Legal Business, and we placed ads in their magazine. And I'm like, hey, what do you think? I mean, and he was like, whoa, this is a $40 billion industry that doesn't have a day-to-day kind of business media publication. Then we partnered up. His name's Andrew Smart. At the time, he lived in Singapore. Now he lives in Bangkok. And together we kind of came up with the idea, the structure of the website. And then it was a great time for me to also leave the company. The company was called CLS. We sold it to Lionbridge, which is basically one of the biggest LSPs in the world. And it was a great time to, basically I moved back from Asia. We sold the company to Lionbridge. So it was a great time to, do something new. And frankly, one of the reasons why I also wanted to start my own business is because once you experience the speed of business and the hustling in China, like you're going to have a hard time going back to a corporate role in a Western setting, like a big corporate role, right? So it's
all the structures and
the momentum. It's like it's very nice to keep that momentum, and you can keep it if you're doing something like if you start your own business, because there's pretty demanding. There's a lot of curveball thrown at you, so that helped, right?
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering how did you start out? I mean, how did that look practical? Was it just a one-man show in the beginning, and just you set up a blog? Or I mean, how did that start? Or did you get in sort of big from the beginning on?
No, well, big in the sense that we didn't hire a bunch of people. I mean, we hired somebody who's still with us now, Gino. He's based in Manila. He was our first writer. Andrew, was helping there as well, obviously, and then we just started. I mean, we took us about half a year to get the website kind of coded and prepped and kind of the framework, and then we just started. I mean, at some point you're going to push the trigger and you say, now it's live. Let's find some stories, right? And then we started. And then we did add a few pieces obviously since then, and we keep adding new services. We started conferencing, we do some advisory work, but really the core at the beginning was the website and the news coverage. And there was a lot of learning. Obviously, we had to understand some of the nuances as well, and actually understand the business. This business is very complex. Also, you're part of the business. I mean, the interpreting space was somewhat new to me. I had some we did send a few interpreters here or there, but it was not something I was particularly familiar with.
And I mean, how did other people get together in the beginning? So you knew Andrew, I think, from another role.
I knew Andrew, So I knew Andrew, and Andrew so had some contacts in Manila. Andrew's been in Asia for almost 25 years, maybe 25 plus years. So we knew that we could hire great writers in the Philippines. So we just started, the three of us, and that's how it started. 3 people. So,
So did you go for people who had a content writing background, or did you specifically look for kind of people with a business journalism background? Because those two training skills, if you like, have very different approaches to writing. Yeah, so hiring great writers is the hardest thing, and then hiring people who have a passion for this industry is even harder.
So you think it goes hand in hand, but apparently it doesn't.
No, you'd think so, right? No, look, I think we even put out an ad, and then he responded. He was Gina at the time. He was the best fit, and then we really got him up to speed in the industry. And now he's quite techy. So now he's our writer who does all the machine translation and kind of AI and neural and natural language processing coverage. So he's that guy now, right? Who's doing all of that.
I mean, that's interesting. It's one of the things that I'd noticed about Slater's coverage is that you're really doing well at owning the coverage of MT and the tech side of the business.
Yeah.
I was amazed at the way that you've managed to get I had to read far too much MT literature than was good for me for the book that I'm writing just now. And to see Slater take that stuff and not just make it understandable, but show how it's relevant without fawning is actually quite... I'm impressed with how well you've done with that. It's like your writers have been trained, you're not just being read by the LSPs, you're being read by the translators and interpreters as well. And it's striking. How do you teach your writers to strike that balance between, here's this great discovery without it turning into, fawning?
Sensationalism or...
Yeah, sensational coverage.
Yeah, so the kind of man versus machine debate gets old really fast, right? I was probably excited about it for like a week, and then I'm like, well, I'm repeating myself here, and then obviously,
totally agree.
I mean, as a former translator, I look at all these new tools and I see, well, we're not there yet, and it's going to take a while, and okay, now it's getting a lot better in certain language combinations and text types. So it's, I guess, that experience that I'm sharing with the writers as well. And there's so much PR out there, and our job often is to just cut through the PR and try to get to the heart of the actual story. And that's pretty hard, I can tell you. I mean, it's because it's always easier just to rewrite the press release. But as we discussed before we went live, but it's this is kind of, I think this is our job to cut through that. And we often also rely on like third-party experts. We just did a piece on something that Google launched, and frankly, it was beyond our kind of technical expertise to understand whether that's a big deal or not. So we'd reach out and they give us feedback, and then we put it in an article. So that's the kind of the journalistic part of it as well.
Maybe just wanted to go back real quick to the press release and editorial coverage, because we did talk about this before the show, and I think it's quite interesting probably for the audience as well, because I don't know if people noticed that, but you have a fairly clear distinction on the site between press releases and editorial articles, so that it's a different format. So it really, even at first glance, you see, okay, this is a press release, and this, maybe you can just quickly explain that was a deliberate decision of yours.
Yeah, and I totally ripped this off CoinDesk, a Bitcoin site. That was great because they also had a different font. It looked like a typewriter font, and I'm like, let's copy that. And so I'm getting a lot of inspiration from that side. No, and it helps because, the press releases, there's a lot of valuable information also in those press releases, but it's just not something that you necessarily want to cover editorially. I mean, if somebody opens an office in a certain country, a lot of people might be interested in that, but it's not something we want to write about editorially as a big deal, right? Or somebody gets an ISO accreditation or things like that. These press releases, they're great. I mean, we do like one or two a day now, and it's kind of become almost like a source of record for the industry. A lot of people are using it. Obviously, it's also generating some revenue for us, which is great. And we also have sponsor content, which is then kind of broader. We help the company frame the story, and we do clearly flag it as sponsor content, but that would live like in the main news feed. But we don't do too many of them. I mean, I guess it's still like one every 20th article would be sponsored, or maybe one every 30th. But
yeah, I was going to say it was a question that we were going to come to later, but I think it's ideal to come to now. In our sector, I'm going to use sector because I have so many colleagues who hate the word industry. In our sector, the LSPs and the tech companies are doing very well at making the headlines. I saw one recently with doctors trying to use machine translation for patient discharge forms, and that went straight to Reuters, and I thought, this is interesting. How would you advise those who don't have a huge budget, especially freelancers who think, actually, there's something more than just the LSPs making the news? We want, the translation and interpreting that's making a difference to make the news as well. How would you advise them to go about earning their own headlines?
Depends where. Where would they earn their headlines?
Well, either with you or with... But this is the question as well, actually, because I've noticed that I'm finding it easier to earn headlines, or at least earn articles in the kind of places my clients would read than in our own kind of general industry press, apart from the magazines that I write for regularly. How if an interpreter had said, there's this amazing thing that's happened, how would you classify, okay, this is a story that we'll cover editorially, this is a press release, and what steps would you advise they go through to try and use Slator to get their news out as well?
So there's just two things. First, let me go back. What you said was very interesting. You said talking to the clients in their own industry. So, if you have a blog, or I don't know, you tweet regularly, but if you can talk to the clients how your service or, your translations or your interpreting is relevant in their particular sector, that's very helpful. Like for me, for example, I was in life sciences or finance, right? I would explain to these people, hey, how good translation really helps you meet your maybe regulatory goals, or helps avoid risks rather on the regulatory side, or maybe expand your market if you're on the marketing side. So if you want to talk to your clients, there you have to be relevant to their sector, not talk too much about the translation, the profession, or the details there. If the translators want to make headlines, we do cover it. We just don't cover it all that often, I guess. It's I think we probably every 10 or 15 articles there's something from the translator side that we cover. When there's how did they pitch me? Send me something that we think is interesting, right? Maybe you started using a certain tool and you found your productivity went up a lot, or you're frustrated with something, or you want to share how agencies are or are not paying, things like that. We're always open to people pitching stories to us, right?
I was just going to ask, basically, how do you find stories? Do you get a lot of pitches? Do you go out? Do you have kind of a method for that, or?
Yeah, it's a mix. So basically, we've developed over the past 3 years a pretty big funnel of just looking at the internet, right? There's a lot of stuff going on, and you can pick up on tweets or blogs, or
right.
Or we track very closely all the publicly listed companies, and you can get a lot of information from those obscure filings they do. So that's for the financial part. So we're putting out a pretty big net. And then yes, people are pitching stories, or they're tipping us off to stories. And then sometimes we have to actually be creative and think about what we could do, and write a report or come up with the new analyze things, or maybe do a survey even. That's what we're probably going to do more going forward. So really generating our own news, which is the hardest, right? You can't. I guess with our means we couldn't do one of those stories a day. That's a little harder. So we call it quick wins when something just comes in, right? When a publicly listed company announces results, boom, we're all over it, and we can publish a story in 2 hours. Those are the thankful stories.
Low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, the low-hanging fruits. That's a better analogy.
Yeah.
Quick wins, I like it. No, I was actually just going to ask you, because I think it's very interesting to discuss you said that you also every 15th or 20th article is about a translator, but then if the business results are being announced, you also publish those, obviously, and you dissect them. So who do you think is your primary target audience of the website in general? Is it the LSPs? Is it businesses out there, in the legal space, in life sciences, and wherever? Or is it the freelancers? Or is it just a healthy mix of the three?
I hope it's a healthy mix. I think it's probably slightly geared towards kind of the senior management of all those big companies, and hopefully also the client side, especially if they have big budgets and they really care what's going on in the industry as a whole. But we really try to make it accessible to everybody. I understand it's a little heavy on the business side, on the financials, and on the technology. I understand that it's also kind of a result of our of just the way we have to curate the content, and what makes headlines and what doesn't make headlines, in a sense. But it should be accessible to everybody. By all, it's free, most of it, and you can just look at the headlines. And we try to write it, as Jonathan pointed out before, in a way that's accessible. So we try to not go too deep into the rabbit hole, even if it's very tempting sometimes, because you can just copy paste some of what these people are saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's particularly the whole business and finance side that was so underserved before. So that's kind of the gap that you're filling, right? So
yeah, that's the gap that we filled. Of course, that was the gap. And there is so many amazing translator blogs or translator publications. You have ATA putting out a ton of very useful content. You have Multilingual Magazine. Now you have new consulting firms as well. So yeah, we do cover the business side that was totally underserved before, because that was kind of where I saw an opening. I'm like, I don't see any of this in this space. Like I see all this other content, but not this, right? So that's the core. But then obviously if we only kind of dissect financial reports, then I'm getting bored, and the readers also get bored. Right?
But I still think that it's a very valuable perspective for you to take, because as Jonathan mentioned, a lot of people in our industry, sorry, not our industry, what do we call it? In
Sector.
Our sector.
Space.
We call it language industry. I wanted to shorten.
Right, yeah.
I started out calling it the language services industry. I'm like, can we just cut the services? It's a language industry. Right?
Can we just make it, Jonathan, can we just coin that and just like keep using it now? Either way, where was I going? Right. So as Jonathan was mentioning, in the language industry, like a lot of people will see themselves as sort of like the starving artists. Whether or not they're starving is up for debate. But I think a lot of the people see themselves as like wordsmiths and like artists of the spoken or written word. And I think a lot of the times they don't necessarily lose track or lose sight of the business elements, but I think it's very good for you to hone in specifically on these business elements and kind of dissect the financial reports, as you've mentioned, because I think it's part of what we do, not only literally translating these types of things or interpreting at these sorts of events, but this is kind of what we need to do in our own business, but we also need to be aware of the other businesses that are working in the same industry as we do.
Those are
so
huge
I think it's really
businesses, right?
Right.
Those are big businesses, and they're fast growing. I mean, we just published our the Slator language service provider index, and I mean, like if you look at the results, most of these companies are growing, like many by double digits. This is a huge industry. It's getting bigger. It's super professional. And there's so much interest from investors. I mean, I talk to investors literally every week. They come and they ask, hey, is this a sector we should be investing in, and so on and so forth. It's an interesting sector. So it's very valuable if you take obviously the linguist perspective, and these people have to be super passionate about what they do day to day. But there's this whole industry element that makes sure that clients that need millions of words translated professionally actually get it done, right? And there's this whole ecosystem of technology and project managers and salespeople and what have you, like corporate infrastructure around it that enables this. So,
right.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing. So I've noticed since I started going to events that my potential clients would go to, that when you learn the trends in a sector, you can actually make smarter decisions. Yeah. And I think that's not just for the big companies. The freelancers as well, you can actually look at whatever sector you're in and go, well, I think in translation, not so much in interpreting, but in translation, they can choose, do I serve this 1 million word to a month market, or do I look at serving, the clients who want a few less? What are you seeing are the big industry trends that are driving decision making?
Well, industry trends depends what you're looking at. In terms of the, I think the machine, let me start with the machine translation component. And again, apologies if I talk a lot about translation and maybe not so much about interpreting. I think we maybe want to talk about this.
We'll get to that.
We'll get there.
I'm just kind of, the translation market is where I'm at home, right? So there, I think the technology is really beginning to impact, or it has begun to impact, at least for the past 12, 18 months. All those in many languages, machine translation has gotten a lot better. There's a lot of more post editing, what they call, going on, or tools that now enable you to work with this. So the speed is picking up. Like you're moving from a world where 250 words, 300 words an hour were kind of the standard for like normal, maybe 400 if you're a little faster. Now we're moving towards 600, 700, and then it gets controversial. Can you do 1,000 words? Can you do 1,500 words? Right? Yeah. That's where like all the Twitter arguments break out.
Indeed.
So that is a big trend we're seeing. There's also, I think all of these platforms are now enabling the client to, if they have some internal project management capabilities, it's easier to source translations directly from the linguists, right? Which it was a little harder to do that maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago. You kind of needed the middleman. Now technologies have become very sophisticated. So if you're willing to, as a client, as a big buyer, if you're willing to actually invest in internal project managers, you can run a lot of that direct, right? And that's what I think there's a certain group of linguists that strongly prefers working directly for clients and not working for what kind of the agencies as they see. Right?
Yeah, the bad agencies.
The bad agencies. I think they're getting probably a worse rep than they should. I mean, I think there's also a vocal minority of translators that keep kind of hitting those evil agencies, but I think it's a small minority. I think there's a lot of positive collaborations between those agencies as well. So, Jonathan, back to your question, I think one trend definitely technology, and then another one some of the systems that you can go direct, and then there's all kinds of other things that's going on. Also, these agencies are getting bigger and bigger. I don't really know what impact that has on the day-to-day for the linguists, but it's definitely a trend on the corporate side.
I mean, it's interesting because I've been thinking about interpreting trends and just talking to people, realizing that I don't think, maybe the two Alexes will disagree with me on this, I don't think there are any global interpreting trends. There's a general, let's look at technology in the booth or whatever, but, what's happening in the UK compared to what's happening in Germany, compared to what's happening in Paris are three completely different things. And it's this favorite word of the industry watchers of fragmentation. It's so interpreting so fragmented that I think it would be challenging to find the trend that's universally applicable. I don't know if the Alexes are going to disagree with me on that.
I don't know. Do you agree? I think, like what I'm seeing is obviously the whole remote, simultaneous, with the app and all of that. That's something that wasn't there 5 years ago. Now it is there. And I think it's probably mostly generating new markets. Because, I can just speak from personal experience. Like we did SlatorCon Tokyo last year. And we actually did, I hosted a panel and I spoke English and the rest of the panelists, except one, spoke Japanese. And I was able to actually hold a discussion with, interpreters sitting in California. So it worked. Like, was it perfect? I guess not, but it worked. And this was something that 5 years ago would simply not have been possible. Plus, I would not have been able, just from a financial viewpoint, actually invest in on-site interpreters.
Yeah.
I think that's something I see. It creates a market where there was none before. That's maybe one of the, I think, broader trends that you could say might apply globally. But fragmented. This entire market is still incredibly fragmented. That's why you have like 10,000 agencies and I don't know how many thousand freelancers.
That would have been my reply as well, because I think it really depends on what kind of subsector you look at. So is it public service? Is it the courts, police, medical, conference? So there's fragmentation there across these different sectors. And then you have different developments in medical in Germany, for example, compared to the US. So it's kind of all over the place, which I don't know if that makes it more interesting or more scary for a publication to cover.
Oh, it's scary. I tell you, it's so scary. And then in the US, like you fall down this giant language access rabbit hole. Because they have these language access rules. I think Clinton started it. So, I think when you interact with the government or something that's government funded. Yeah. And I'm out of my depth already. But
you're selling it really well.
It generates a huge market for interpretation. And that's why you have giant interpreting companies like Language Line, Syracom over there that we don't have in Europe. Here it's still a lot more fragmented.
Yeah, but I also think in the United States it's a very interesting situation in the market in that you really have two very prevalent languages that does need a lot of going back and forth in between, like with Spanish and a lot of, immigration is coming from Latin America. And I think that is a very focused approach that they have for their language market, which in Europe, obviously, you don't have. And I guess also in Asia, you don't really see it like that.
No, you don't have this at all in Asia. Yeah.
And it is interesting, I think, in mainland Europe, certainly the big conference cities tend to be dominated by the international organisations who do things. In the UK, outside of London, they don't really exist. So, like, the vast majority of my work has been for private clients via agencies or directly. And even there, probably about a third of it has been international organization related. The rest has just been, here's this thing we want to do. Or the Scottish government saying, here's this event we're doing. And I think this is the interesting thing that I've only ever had one even possible remote interpreting assignment, but I have had assignments where the clients have gone, hold on a minute, the room's too small, let's set up a video link.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, I'm not sure if that's a trend or if that's just a client going, oh, we forgot about something important. What was that again?
Yeah.
But I mean, since we talked about regions and geographical areas, I'm wondering now maybe more on your field of expertise or from your perspective, do you see sort of trends that are different or things that emerge in one region but never really show up in another one? Is there something that's kind of interesting that you've noticed?
On the translation side or interpreting or both?
What both, I guess, or whatever you feel comfortable, talking about, I guess.
I think that's the interesting part, that it's pretty global, actually. I think I mean, Asia is a little different because just some of the countries are maybe, not a little less developed or in a different stage of the development curve, as it were, right? So you just have fewer. I mean, there's less business in a place like Indonesia. They have, in a sense, different problems than perfect translation. I guess on a scale. I mean, there's don't get me wrong. There's a lot of good translation companies there, but it's less sizable as a market. But in the mature markets like Europe and the US, I think it's fairly similar. On the interpreting side, I think the US is a standout with all the what they call OPI, over the phone. I think that is different. Maybe Scandinavia is, in a sense, more centralized when it comes to interpreting for new arrivals, like immigrants in the country. I think, for example, in Switzerland, there is no company providing like that service to the government. I think the UK and Scandinavia is pretty centralized, right? Framework contracts, everything's sourced by one vendor or two vendors. Switzerland, Germany is just like individuals or smaller companies serving that market. But yeah, on the translation side, very much in terms of development and maturity, I think they're fairly aligned. Interpreting is even more more fragmented.
Fragmented and messy, I guess.
Yeah, let's see. I mean, like with all those new apps, I mean, I would love to hear your perspective where you see this going. I mean, again, I think it's actually generating a new market, and maybe certain international organizations, if they want to cut costs, maybe they go remote. But I haven't seen that en masse yet. Do you think this is a massive trend and it's going to change in the next 2 years, or is it still like far future? And I know you've spoken about this before. I actually listened to your podcast on that before. But
thank you. Well, I actually think it's just a big boogeyman at the moment, just because it's no, I think it's like the international boogeyman, and this is across the globe. I think it's true. I think it's because it's the big unknown. Like, nobody really knows how to handle the technology. Nobody really knows how it's going to impact the business, and nobody really knows for sure how it's going to take over the conferencing world or not, as it were. So I think that's why a lot of focus is being put on it. I don't think that we're anywhere close to commercially being replaced by apps and we're just going to go hide somewhere in a basement. I don't think that's happening anytime soon. I think I think you really need to separate the different use cases for RSI, because as you've mentioned, in the States, it's a big thing with language access. So, you might be at immigrations, you might be at the doctors, you might be at, I don't know, registering at the city hall or whatever you do. And there it's really a thing where it's a legal necessity, or even in the UK, you have the same thing. So I think that's one thing. And even there in Germany, we're kind of slowly moving towards that. So for example, when it comes to like doctor's visits, like we already use RSI, but it's very basic level interpreting. It's kind of like, does your arm hurt? Yes. Where? Here. Does it hurt now? Yes. Okay. So those kinds of, use cases, like that is fine. That's totally okay. But I think where it gets more complicated, and where I really don't think we're anywhere close to, at least me being worried, maybe I'm just being naive or too optimistic, is really just in the conferencing industry. I don't see a usable wholesale solution coming in anytime soon that would, A, please all the clients, and B, please all the interpreters. I mean, there's always going to be some people who do anything, you know what I mean? Like, you'll always find somebody willing to use a product if it's available, and you will always be willing, you will always find somebody who's willing to work for someone if they offer them work. That's always been the case in the history of mankind, I guess, or humankind, sorry. But yeah,
I hear you.
It's a very long and rambling answer. I'm sorry.
The conferencing market is a tough one, and I also think so. What I used to do, I'm not sure if that's huge in Europe, but in China it was very big at the time. Still is. We like, for investment firms, we actually sent interpreters along with the client to like 2 or 3 day trips. So they, like a big private equity fund would scope out potential partners in mainland China, and then the interpreter would join them. And I mean, and those interpreters had to be phenomenal. I mean, not only interpreting, but also like, you know, the cultural element.
Yeah.
And that was, I don't see that on an app.
This is the I don't want to give away too much of the new book, but this is one of the arguments that I've been making in quite a few places at the moment, is that historically, I don't know, I can't speak for translation technology, but interpreting technology has historically overpromised and underdelivered.
Oh, I like that phrase. We used that once with gadgets in an article. Great.
Yeah.
It's true, yeah.
It's so true.
By the time this goes live, I've got a 2-page piece coming out in the ATA Chronicle, having some fun with the way that machine interpreting has been marketed. And it's not the same for remote simultaneous interpreting. There are some very good, very well thought out solutions there. But the hysteria around the PR around remote simultaneous interpreting has been crazy at times. And I think you're right. I think it will create new markets. I think it's likely to familiarize clients with what interpreting can do, and it could actually create more conference work. But I think my argument has been for a while now, it really depends what interpreters do. And, you know, there is a scope in certain markets that interpreters just sit back passive and go, you know, bring me work, or, you know, why should I be a consultant? The work just comes. That there are clients who would readily just snap up remote and suddenly they'll find that their work is remote. But the interpreters who are going to go to the trade shows, who are going to learn an industry, who are going to be able to go with the equity firm, or I've done a multi-million-pound business negotiation once where I flew out to somewhere and I was there just working through the negotiation with them and interpreting. That kind of stuff, there's power in having hired a physical interpreter that I don't think anyone's going to want to replace with an app, because it changes the game. And I've actually done 2 negotiations, and in both of them, I realized at one point that I was there as much to politically as I was to actually interpret, especially one where the company signed off on the deal at the end. The CEO of the company who was selling goods and the procurement guy from the company who were buying admitted at various points during the meeting that they understood French and English absolutely fine, but they decided not to do it in each other's language.
Yeah.
And I'm like, they're not getting an app to do that.
No.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think maybe just for completeness sake, I think in the institutions it's a little bit different because we have all this infrastructure in place, you know, the meeting rooms with the booths and, you know, a big group of staff interpreters or freelance interpreters. So I think the situation is a little bit different. But what's certainly happening is more, I think, what we call remote participation. So people calling in from somewhere and the interpreters are still in the room. So I think it's a very different situation, I guess, just to make a long story short.
Yeah, and also at that point, it's so critical. I mean, you want to make sure you get the absolute best quality possible. I mean, people are deliberating about an entire continent where you are. So
yeah, plus you have stuff like privacy and, you know, that kind of thing. So, yeah.
But I also think it's being really promised and
under-delivered.
Promising and under-delivered.
Yeah, but come on, cut these companies a break. They're looking for funding, you know.
That's what they do, yeah.
And that's the thing. I think it's a very big topic at the moment because it's also very sexy. You know, you can sell it very easily and everybody immediately gets it. And I think with interpreting, it's even more immediate than with translation, because with translation, like, everybody can go on Google Translate, like they have a letter that they don't get, you just put it in there and you sort of kind of get what it means. And that's why I think, I don't know if people, I'm kind of getting sidetracked here, but the point that I'm trying to make with interpreting is that everybody understands if you go somewhere and you have an app and you can immediately talk to people in Hong Kong, in Shanghai, without any delay, without knowing the language, that's powerful. People get that. Whereas if you have a piece of written text, like, they can sort of get around that. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I think it's a very easy it's a very easy sell, and that's why a lot of those companies are so efficient in their marketing and also in their investment rounds.
Yeah, and again, they have to. I mean, you can't if you're modest in your press release. That's
of course, right? That's never great.
So I don't think we should take everything. We should take everything they say with a grain of salt. I mean, that's what we're seeing at Slator as well. I mean, 3 years ago we were writing about, like, we're trying to cut out all the disruption and it's all new. And I mean, frankly, in certain aspects, I have to say though, there has been a leap. I mean, especially obviously on the machine translation side with all those neural systems. It's a lot better. I mean, 3 of us here are native German speakers, and I mean it went from like not being able to put, obviously not getting the cases and the verb at the end and all of that, and we're there now, right? I mean, it's much more, the syntax is better, grammar is better. You still need a human to look at it if it's critical or high risk content, but it's gotten a lot better. So
that's very true.
They have made some of the hype has materialized. Let's put it this way.
So from a business perspective, in terms of RSI, do you see that there are a lot of big busts in the industry? Like, do you see a lot of those overhyped companies coming in hot, getting a ton of funding, and then they just kind of evaporate? Or do you see sort of more mergers and acquisitions?
No, not yet. No, I think, again, because what theirs is it's so clear that they're generating a new market, which is unusual. I mean, in translation, it's a little more complex to see how you're generating a new market just by being super cheap, right? In interpreting, you're actually creating new use cases on a massive scale. If all of a sudden, for a fraction of the cost, and that fraction of the cost doesn't have to be at the detriment of the linguist, right? I mean, you can still pay linguists the same amount of money, but you're cutting out all of the physical stuff around it. Right. That generates new markets where there were none before. I mean, if I can afford it for SlatorCon for $3,000, great, I'll do it. If I have to pay $20,000, I mean, that eats away my entire budget. I can't do it, right? So they have to be very active in marketing to actually make people aware that this is now an option. Right. Mm-hmm. So no, you don't have to rely on the magic of a fully automated solution that just doesn't work and is embarrassing, right? But you don't have to actually put up a physical booth. So it is, in a sense, it's a much harder sales pitch because you're convincing people to do something they haven't done before. But that's the exciting part too, though,
point,
right?
Yeah, of course. So. But I think my question was really more getting at, because you've been obviously observing like all the trends for, I don't know how long that's been going on, like 3, 4, 5 years.
Yeah.
Have you seen a consolidation in remote interpreting?
No, the opposite, right? Everybody's starting new.
Because that's kind of how it feels.
Yeah, no, there hasn't been any concept. There's new stuff in there. There's new companies in there. There's new funding. I haven't seen anybody go bust yet. So I think, like in a ball of fire, right? That we noticed. I mean, maybe a couple have disappeared that we weren't aware of, but there hasn't been a major bankruptcy or anything like that. So, no. I think it's a growing market.
Because I think that the point when it gets really interesting, also maybe when we need to start taking it even more seriously, is when you start seeing more market consolidation and more mergers between the different companies, just one company acquiring the other because of the technologies that they have, because the customer base or whatever it may be. Because then I think that's then the point when they kind of have their ground level game figured out, and then it's really about honing the product quality in that instance is kind of the wrong term, but you get what I'm saying. So I think
it's too early for that, though.
Right.
This is like they're not in the consolidation M&A phase that the translation industry is in. In the translation industry, you have those 20-year-old and increasingly gigantic companies that that have the capital and they can acquire competitors and get even bigger, right? So that there's that handful of super agencies in that remote simultaneous market. It's a new market. It wasn't there 5 years ago. So everybody's trying to grab the piece of the pie and grow the pie. Right? So there's no, I guess, M&A there yet. It's just everybody trying to conquer it first, right?
So if we say that in the translation space, this has taken about 20 years, give or take, I don't think it's going to take another 20 years in the interpreting market just because of the speed that the technology is evolving in and just because of the maturity of the overall language industry. But maybe like in the next 5 to 10 years, we would start to see some of that movement in the market. I don't know.
No, it's a good point. Look, I don't think there's a clear winner yet. I mean, there's these big interpreting firms. I mean, there's on the one hand the OPI firms in the US, and then you have some bigger players in the UK and in Scandinavia that do kind of it's almost like a staffing job, right? Or also OPI. they take care of like the scheduling thing en masse, etc., like with the traditional interpreters.
Mhm.
There's no clear big giant yet in the app RSI space at all.
Right.
So
Yeah,
It's going to be interesting. Yeah, how
it's going to be
plays out.
interesting. I mean, it's the race is on. So.
Yeah, for sure.
I was going to say, just to move on to a slightly different subject,
Uh-huh.
how important would you say this kind of entrepreneurial corporate mindset is for individual freelancers? Would you advise freelancers to think more like the entrepreneurs who are funding these new businesses, or is there some other model that they should be looking at instead?
I think they shouldn't focus. I mean, if it's not a passion, they shouldn't focus too much on the business side per se, because if you're a great translator or interpreter, you're going to get work eventually, because they're always in demand. So do you need to be the best business person? Not really. You need to be the best translator interpreter, because if you are the best translator interpreter in your niche, you're going to get work. And then if you're a good business person, sooner or later, you're not going to be able to translate or interpret anymore, because you've built something that will attract so much more work that you're going to have to farm it out, right? A lot of these translation companies started because like one overworked translator started farming out to his friends and colleagues, and then like started to grow, and then he was just busy with all the financial, and at some point it's just like, okay, I'm going to be a manager now. So the business component, I mean, if you're a great linguist, translator, interpreter, I think you'll be maxed out pretty soon, right?
Yeah.
On a day-to-day. So
I think a lot of people will be very glad to hear that.
so maybe the business component will come in if you really want to just do stuff that you love to do, right? So if you can really market yourself as, in a particular niche as the single resource to go, and you really don't want to touch that contract, you only want to do this particular
Like
text segment,
specialization, yeah.
then maybe you have to put a bit more work into your own marketing. And if you're more business savvy, then it's easier, right? But I mean, I just from personal experience, I know how hard it is to find and then also maintain and keep a good relationship with translators and interpreters. I mean, my God, interpreters so many times I'm like, please, can you please go there, please?
Are you saying we're difficult?
The interpreter diva.
The client wants you. The client doesn't want her. The client wants you.
Okay, wow.
I am still waiting for those days to come in the non-London UK market.
Yeah.
But I think this is probably historically why interpreters tend to gravitate towards certain cities, because if that's where a lot of the market is, it's much easier to attract work if you're in the middle of Brussels or Paris or somewhere else.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Alex.
No, because I was going to completely change gears. I don't know.
Yeah, me too.
All right. So you go first.
Okay. Yeah, because I wanted to get to the SlatorCon, which you
me
mentioned
too.
a couple of
Good
times.
for you.
Yeah. So go ahead, Alex. You do that.
No, because I'm really curious, because obviously you started SlatorCon, you obviously started expanding it, and I think it's just a really interesting transition to go from an online business translation focused platform to do face-to-face events for industry insiders. And how did that come about? Like, why did you think that was a good idea to expand or no? I don't even know if it's an expansion, but to do these face-to-face events.
It's very natural, actually. It's kind of, if you look at the business media model, the two go hand in hand.
Right.
If you have a successful publication, then you typically also try to do a conference, or if you have a super successful conference, you try to do the publication. It's a very natural kind of, it complements each other very well. And SlatorCon, it's kind of modeled after a conference that I'd like to go to, because I was sitting through so many like long and winding life science presentations for
don't tell us about it.
minutes about this molecule.
Story of our lives.
Why am I here? Why am I listening to this?
Yeah.
And then so we kind of try to keep it short in the afternoon, or you start at like 11 a.m. in the morning and keep the presentations to 20 minutes. So no, basically from a business model perspective, it's very natural to do conferencing if you have a publication.
Okay.
Because also it gives us, we were talking about how we source content. Doing one SlatorCon gives us a ton of content and original content and video and interviews and photos.
That's right. Yeah.
Which is fantastic. So for example, when we cover a lot of these companies now, I can actually add like the image we put in the article is now quite often kind of an image we pull from SlatorCon. Like, hey, here's the CEO, and there's a Slator logo in the back, and it's the article's image. So that really helps. Yeah.
I imagine that this is maybe a little bit easier for you than, let's say, for a traditional publication, because your company is still quite new, so you don't have that, a lot of legacy when it comes to maybe even a paper publication. You started online, you've always been online, so maybe it's easier for you to adapt to these changes, because there's a lot of stuff happening to media and publishing at the moment, and some of the sort of more established companies seem to be having trouble to adapt to new business models and new events and the things that one has to do these days.
Yeah, that's correct. I think it's obviously it's easier if you start in 2015 like we did, and I mean the disruption in a sense in that space has already happened, right? So we had to start from that base. That said, though, it's also amazing how easy it is to put some of these things together. I mean, 15 years ago, just coding our website would have cost $1 million. Now it's so much easier, right? So it's good and bad. And with the media space, I think if you have expertise and content that's not available anywhere else, I think it's still a valuable proposition. But maybe it doesn't maintain like a giant editorial staff in a skyscraper in downtown somewhere. Those days are over. But
yeah.
But you got to be a lot leaner to.
So you all work remotely? Just a quick question, or?
Well, I have an office, and we have somebody based in London, Esther.
Esther, yeah.
She also she works out of an office. Like we don't sit together. Obviously, we have somebody in Manila, London, Singapore, like Bangkok. So yeah, but it works well.
Cool. So I want to ask a kind of more controversial question about SlatorCons.
Ooh.
See, this is the thing. They say it's my catchphrase, but I say it like once every 3 episodes. No, so I know you alluded to earlier the kind of vocal minority who are against agencies and see them as big evil, but there is some kind of discontent, that this feeling that senior management of the big agencies don't understand freelancing, don't understand how freelancers work. Is there a risk that, because at SlatorCon you have all these C-suite people speaking, do you find, is SlatorCon kind of making the gap between the C-suite and the freelancer wider, or are you not particularly concerned about whether freelancers would come or be able to speak or anything?
No, it's a good question. I think it's more a function of there's so many conferences that have linguists speak, that are built around linguists, and they have been around for a long time. So we kind of had to carve our niche. And our niche was the C-suite and those topics, and also putting big service buyers on stage. I mean, we had some of the largest service buyers in this industry present at SlatorCon. So it's more kind of a result of this, rather than kind of a deliberate choice, like not to feature freelancers. And frankly, I mean, we're going to do one in San Francisco. I'm actually thinking about having a panel with linguists. I just really wanted to focus the business element for the first, what's been now maybe 9 SlatorCons, 10 SlatorCons, and I think if we had just done in a quote unquote another translation conference, I think it would have failed. So we needed to be pretty unique to actually, the conferencing market is extremely competitive in this space. I mean, there's so many conferences. So you got to set yourself apart a little bit.
And I think it's getting the right people in the room as well, because I know freelancers who I would not allow in the same room as a C-suite person. And yet I know others, and I think, well, actually their experience and their point of view would be really useful. So, there's a question of trust, and there's a question of alienation, and there's a question of, are all of these technologies actually making it harder to find quality people because a lot of the really good people don't want to sit behind the platform? I know I had a discussion with one of my clients saying, I'd love to work with you, but I don't want to be expected to sit on a platform bidding for jobs, especially not for interpreting jobs. That's just not on.
Yeah.
And there was an understanding, the project manager said, we like working with you, we'll find a way. But I don't think the guys in the C-suite realized that you can actually destroy relationships if you're not careful. And I think there's a discussion to be had about how agencies and freelancers relate to each other on a B2B level.
Yeah, but I think a fair amount of agencies probably do a good job, and I mean they should, because if you end up with a terrible reputation among linguists, it's going to hurt your business as well. So you better invest a little bit in that component. I mean, they're an absolutely essential part of the business, if not the essential part at the end of the day. I mean, if you can't secure the right linguist, then what are you going to do? Then you're, you use the machine, but that's not going to work long term. So, look, I would love to have a controversial discussion with, at some point with linguists and C-suite. I don't think it would be super controversial though. I mean, I think those are kind of partners at some point in time. So look, taking your input, I think we should probably do it at some point. Yeah.
And maybe just to connect here, I think the next SlatorCon that's coming up is in London in May. Can you share something what's going to happen already, or is it top secret?
No, it's not. It shouldn't be. I'm a little late with all the agenda as usual. No, but it's going to be a great one again. So we're going to have it's May 16th, just off Hyde Park, fantastic location, and we're going to have two CEOs, the CEO of Lionbridge, John Fennelly, and the CEO of We Localize, Smith Ewell. We're going to have somebody from Atlassian, a big software company out of Australia, and she's in the localization there. We have somebody from life sciences, and then we have a media localization panel. So media localization is something that has been growing super fast because of Netflix and all these over-the-top providers. So all the whole subtitling and dubbing market. I mean, talking about disruption and new ways of working, that market has undergone a tremendous change over the past 5 years. It was kind of a somewhat maybe a little bit sleepy part of the industry. I mean, dubbing, subtitling, and then Netflix and all the streaming comes along and it just explodes. And there you also have new cloud solutions. So it's a pretty interesting space to talk about. So we're going to have a panel on that. Yeah,
that's great.
All crammed into one afternoon.
Yeah, that's what I noticed. Though is fairly short and intense, but that's intentional, I suppose, because people are busy.
And also, people are busy, and you get the C-suite by doing it so they can fly in and out the same day.
Right.
We actually have a fair amount of people that really do this. Like last time in Zurich, probably half of the people just flew in and out the same day.
Right.
Because if you want to keep these people for 3 days, you're gonna have to put on a giant show and have gazillion clients there, so that's a different.
So you get the networking and business development in as well.
We do this in one afternoon. You get a lot done. You meet a lot of people, and I think the presentations are interesting as well. So
you guess?
No, they are. I mean, and it's one of the few conferences where everybody actually sits in the room and listens to the presentation when it's going on. Is it something that happens in the background and everybody stays out and drinks coffee and networks?
Yeah, exactly.
People are there, right?
So true. Yeah. So maybe moving towards the end, I wanted to put you on the spot a little bit and wondering. I mean, you have done some interpreting coverage in the past, and we were fortunate enough to contribute to that a little bit. So I'm wondering if you plan on extending that coverage at all, and into what kind of specific direction it may be moving.
Good question. I think there we're depending a little bit on what we call the news flow, right? I mean, we do love to cover all those RSI startups as they get the money and get funded, right? And if there's another round of funding, like in that space, we're obviously gonna look into it. There might be stories coming out of the US. I mean, there's some talk that like language access is in danger because of, Trump could like literally just stop it by the stroke of a pen. There was a story recently.
Oh my God, yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but it's just that this is an interesting market as well. There, I think probably from a ratio point of view, we're going to keep it as it is now. I know that's probably not enough for you, but the translation side of it is just so vast and complex and fast moving. So we want to keep covering that pretty intensely as well. Yeah. I'm not sure I answer your question. So I don't have a strategic plan. Let me put it this way. I don't have a strategic plan to cover interpretation. What we should do, though, is we should write a research report about interpretation. Like we've done all these verticals like games and finance and media. We should probably do something on interpretation, a deeper dive, and we'll reach out.
And the research reports are basically in-depth sort of publications that sort of also provide additional income for you, but go much deeper than the day-to-day coverage, I suppose.
Yeah, we need some money. So
Don't we all?
those we sell. I mean, it's still extremely affordable. Obviously, most of them sell for like $85, and we have some for like $380 when it's M&A reports with pretty exclusive data and things like that. So those are like 20, 30, 40 page reports that you can download.
Yeah, and I've seen. I'm really glad to see Slator doing good methodology. I've got a PhD in interpreting studies, and there was a fairly recent research report that I pointed out the flaws of because they completely missed they completely missed a section of the market which arguably would have changed their results. And I think with interpreting especially, it's the not ignoring the freelancers and the smaller suppliers is going to be key to figure out what's actually going on in the market.
Yeah. Oh my God, methodology. Yeah, I know. It's
I'm a methods geek.
Hard.
Sorry.
I'll let you know. I'll let you proofread our next report.
You just got yourself more work there, Jonathan.
Boom! Here is 20 pages. Please, I need it back tomorrow.
I have literally just finished. We've just done the final draft of a methodology, a letter to the editor for a paper that came out in a medical journal that completely doesn't understand interpreting or translation at all. And it's like, how do we get all this criticism into 400 words? It's kind of shrinking it more and more and more and more.
Yeah.
Nice.
Okay, great. Well, listen, Florian, this has been extremely interesting. So thanks for taking so much time out of your day. And it's quite late here in Central Europe. So thank you for taking the time. Maybe we can let you plug something before we clear out. I mean, for those people who don't know, everything's on Slator.com. But I think you just started something new, right? The Slator Sweep.
Yeah, thanks. I don't think people really understand that one yet. But
here's your chance to explain it.
Here's my chance to explain it. Look, so we're I just talked about that funnel that we're using to create the editorial content. So basically this is part of the funnel we're passing on to readers, so you can subscribe to that, and you get a daily email where basically it links not to Slator content, but to just all the relevant story of the day that have any connection to this industry. So it's a sweep. So it's probably 5, 10, 20 stories a day that you get. And I mean, it's curated, but we don't provide any additional commentary or anything like that to it. So it's like a super highly curated industry feed.
One final question, which we should have asked at the very beginning, because where does the name Slator come from?
Translator.
Oh, it's Translator. It's just a brief name.
It's just from Translator? Yeah, okay.
I'm not a creative person, so I sourced this on Odesk. That person came back with about 10 suggestions. 9 of them were atrocious, but then Slator, I'm like, that's a good name. Short and sweet. The domain was not available, but it took me just about 2 weeks and some fighting and investment to get it. It's a nice, what is it, 6-letter domain.com? That's great. Right.
I have been called an interpretator, so I am waiting for interpretator.com to go somewhere.
You should do that. You should buy that.
So terp.com is actually for sale starting at 999 euros.
Really? Me buying tomorrow? Wow.